So we are here. I'm with my colleague Kate, who is going to help us go through this interval training session of my first lesson. So the first thing I would do with my students is introduce myself, and I would also point to their attention this link in the web links area to be able to check out my profile if they had any questions. I'm also going to present to them the intervals lesson plan, which Kate, you should be able to see on the right side of your screen. That shows you that the lesson was by me, and our objective for this lesson will be to identify, or be able by the end of it to identify the intervals of a unison, an octave, and a perfect fifth. Now Kate is an experienced musician, so this will go pretty quickly for her. Obviously with students we will take our time. I would also, with a group of this class, depending on the number, ask them to introduce themselves and create some sort of classroom dynamic. I might ask them to explain their musical background, or if they're in a band classroom, what instrument they play, but that would be for a larger class. Anyway, so the first thing we do after that would be ask about intervals and your experience with intervals, and say, what is an interval? What do you think of with an interval? And Kate knows the answer, but I would normally get a lot of nothings. So then I might provide some sort of an oral element to say, okay, well, this is an example of an interval. And so since I'm in front of a piano, I'm able to create some sort of an oral sense. I'd say, here's another example. And I'd say, this is another example still. And then as this is going up, I'd say, students, could you please raise your hand when you think you have an idea of what an interval means? And if they were unfamiliar with the raising their hand idea, I would tell them to look at the top of their screen and notice that there is a little icon with a man whose hand is raised. So they should raise their hand when they feel like they have an idea. So Kate, when you feel like you have an idea about what an interval is, go ahead and raise your hand. And I would say, or raise your hand on the module, so that you're using the top of the screen and clicking on the button that it tells you that, there you go, very good. And so as one person raised their hand, I would say that's great, and I might ask you to type your response in the chat. As you were doing that, I would also say, this is not an example of an interval, and I would say, this is an example of two intervals. And eventually we would arrive at the conclusive answer that an interval is, Kate's going to type her answer. She is able to notify us that an interval is the distance between two notes, which is exactly correct. And so from there we would say, okay, well, you heard me play a number of different notes and there were differences between them. Even when we play more than one note, you're getting multiple intervals. So the first interval that we would learn would be a unison, and I would explain a unison is actually just the same note played twice. And while I do that, I will also bring up this picture of an interval of a unison that looks like this. So Kate's able to see the picture of the same note played twice, and that would sound like this. You can't play that harmonically because it would just be the same sound simultaneously. This is another unison. So pretty much anytime you hear a song or something where the note is played simultaneously or repetitively, it becomes an interval. And I might use an example where I would play a song and there's a melody where the same note is played over and over again. And so that beginning section where the same note is played over and over again is an example of a melody that includes a unison. The next interval I would bring up would be the interval of an octave, and I would bring up the picture of an octave. That would look like this. So these two notes, Kate, you can see this, correct?
Yeah.
Perfect fifth. So we have those notes. Because they're familiar with scales and the fact that these other notes are all pretty straightforward, as a group of 3 or more people, they shouldn't have a problem with that. And I would hit the start breakout session button, and I would sort everybody into a group evenly, and in this case I'm going to put Kate in breakout group 1, and I could go in there and monitor what she's doing. As we go through here, I would give them all a couple minutes and check out if anybody's having any questions or problems. They would usually raise their hand in this setting, as I would have instructed them to. Kate has told me that in the breakout session and bring Kate back into the main meeting. And I will then also be in the main meeting with everybody else, and we can go over our answers. So I would ask somebody from group 1 to explain, in this case Kate, what the interval of a perfect unison above a D is, and type their answer to everybody. And Kate's going to type that the perfect unison above a D is a D, which is exactly correct. So I would say great job, so everybody can see. That's fantastic. Then I would ask somebody from group 2 to explain or post what an octave above the E is, and somebody from group 2, being a genius, would know that that's an E, and I'd say very nice. And then I'd ask somebody from group 3 to post a perfect fifth up from F, and they would correctly identify that as a C, and I would say fantastic. So everybody would be able to point out their individual intervals. I probably wouldn't have each group explain all 3 of them. What I would do at this point, however, is ask anybody who has a question to raise their hand, and since nobody has any questions, I think we're in good shape. So the next activity we would do would be to ask a poll, and so I will bring up as an informal assessment a question for Kate to start with a visual poll here. So I'm going to ask Kate to vote on this poll, which asks them which of the following intervals create a perfect fifth, and she is able to correctly identify that. After a while I'd end it, and I would point out that in fact the first answer, A to E, is the correct one. If you all got that, they would hopefully feel better. And if they had a hard time with it, then I would say that's okay. If we needed to, I would go over the intervals again. Since Kate is on top of things, I would say that's fantastic and she doesn't need to worry about it. And so we go on to the next poll, which is an oral poll. So what I'll do here is I'll play the interval for them and ask them to vote on it. And I'd actually do this multiple times. So I'm going to do this twice now. So I'll play an interval and I'll play it twice and ask everybody to vote. So here's the first interval. And here I am playing it again, and I'd ask everybody to place their votes. And Kate did a fantastic job pointing out that it's an octave. So I would end this poll and say it's great, and I'm going to reopen it. I'm sorry, I'm going to edit it and try it one more time and do a second example. So this is another oral poll. I'll play another interval and ask everybody to do the same thing. And then I play it again. And Kate was very astute and able to point out that that's another interval we didn't learn yet. That would be a little tricky, and I would imagine many people would have a hard time hearing that. And I would point out that this is what a unison would sound like. Here's an octave. Here's a perfect fifth. And since it was not one of those sounds, you know, they weren't able to hear as the beginning of Superman, or the same note played twice, or that doesn't really sound like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I would say that the best option for them would all be the other option. Okay, and then I would do one more poll, which would be the written one, and ask them each to look at the question of what the distance between the notes G and A was, and Kate would be able to answer that that's also an other, right? A G to an A are in fact further closer than a perfect fifth, but further than a unison. And so that is not going to be a problem for her at all, since she is, of course, very much on top of the questions there. So then I'm going to bring up my file share files so that I can bring up my questions here. I'm going to ask a few quiz questions for everybody and ask them to point out the intervals that they're going to see. Hide this and share a file. Alright, first I have to open the document. And so what I'm going to do now is show everyone an interval and ask them to identify what it is. Let's see if I can make this a little smaller. So this is now all visual, right? They're going to take a look at this visual interval, and I'm going to ask everyone to vote using the poll again. Except instead of the oral example, here we go, it'll come up. Let me close this and reopen it. Okay, so here we are again, and because Kate's the only one in the room, she's going to be able to identify this written interval as an octave, and that's exactly right. And what I would do is I would check this. Instead of going over this individually, I would see what everybody came up with, and I'd kind of take note of what they did. I would then bring up the next interval and say, we'll try another example. And here again, I will have to reset the poll, or Kate would point out individually that it's correct. She's a nice head of the game, but she sees this as a perfect fifth, and it can be written melonically or harmonically. And I do this for 5 or 6 of them. I do have multiple examples here, but I don't want to waste too much time for our examples version here. So here's one more interval we'll try, and again I will reopen that poll for everybody, and Kate will be able to identify that interval flawlessly because she knows very well that in fact it is a perfect fifth. And while this is happening, I could take a screenshot of everybody's answers, and that way I have a record of what everyone did with the actual picture of the interval next to it to take notes if anybody was having any questions. And then as that goes through, I would readdress any particular issues that may have come up, and thank everybody for their time, and say I would see you guys next time. Way to have a fantastic lesson. And thank you, Kate, for your fantastic enthusiasm and all of your help. And have a great